God always wants us to find our rest in Him, but sometimes in life, God will lead us into a more intentional season of pulling away from the things He's called us to do so that we can be rejuvenated in Him. So here are 3 signs that God is leading you into an intentional season of rest in Him. Number 1. If your exhaustion is leading to habitual sin, this is a good sign God is calling you into an intentional season of resting in Him. God has made humans to be dependent creatures. God is infinite and in need of nothing. We, on the other hand, are very finite and in need of many things. We need air constantly to breathe. We need food and water every single day. We need our living environments to be a certain temperature or we're going to die. And of course, we also need sleep. When our bodies and our minds lack physical rest, we can literally go insane. So when it comes to the spiritual side of things, it's very similar to that. God designed our hearts, our spiritual well-being, to be directly connected to how much rest we're getting in the Lord. When we lack that rest in God that we were designed to have, our hearts will begin to work improperly. We'll start malfunctioning. And when we malfunction, that means we're going to start sinning. Sin is a sign that something is malfunctioning in your heart. Oftentimes, we think that sin is the primary problem, but oftentimes sin is actually a symptom of a deeper problem going on, namely our lack of connection with God. Sin not only distances us from God, sin is the result of us being distant from God. So when our relationship with God is going well, we're going to have less sin in our lives. When our relationship with God is not going well, the result of that will be an increase of sin in our lives. Gluttony, binge watching, sexual addiction. These habitual sins are often a symptom of us not finding our rest and rejuvenation in the Lord. Spiritual depletion and exhaustion will literally kill your heart. In Isaiah 30, verses 15 and 18, it states, "In repentance and rest is your salvation. In quietness and trust is your strength. But you would have none of it." Jumping down to verse 18, it states, "Yet the Lord longs to be gracious to you. He rises to show you compassion. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all who wait for Him." Notice the link between repentance and rest as mentioned in verse 15. So if you are dealing with a sin cycle in your life, it could be due to a lack of resting in the Lord. Number 2, if your spiritual productivity is starting to slip, this is a good sign God is calling you into a season of rest. Right from the beginning in Genesis 1, God set us a pattern that He wants us to follow where we are supposed to work and supposed to rest. In Exodus 20, starting in verse 8, it states, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God." Jumping down to verse 11, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." When we ignore God's command to find rest in Him, we don't become more productive because we're working more. We actually become less productive even though we're working more. God can do more with 6 days of work that you're trusting Him in rather than you working 7 days where you're not trusting God. In a very practical way, the more overworked we become, the less productive we are with the work that we do. So if your spiritual productivity is starting to slip, this is a good sign God is calling you to find more rest in Him. And number 3, if you're beginning to despise your calling from God, this is a sign God is calling you to find your rest in Him. When you read Mark 6, Jesus had just sent out the 12 disciples 2 by 2 to go and preach, heal, and cast out demons. So when you get to Mark 6, starting in verse 30, we see that the group has just all come back together again and they were tired. It states, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. Notice that word rest. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the town and got there ahead of them. Pausing for a moment here, if I was one of the disciples in this scenario, I would have been really annoyed with all the people who were gathering. This was supposed to be a time just for the disciples and Jesus to reconnect and get some much needed relaxation after serving so many people already. But notice how Jesus responds in Mark 6 verses 34 through 37 and pushed the disciples past their comfort level. Picking up in verse 34, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? Pausing here again for a moment, when you read between the lines, it's not hard to imagine the tension building between Jesus and the disciples. The disciples seemed totally done, but Jesus was asking even more of them. They had just gotten back from being sent out 2 by 2. And in Mark 6, verse 30, Jesus seems to have promised them some rest and alone time with just him. But now Jesus is pushing them to serve even more because this unexpected crowd showed up. The disciples eventually obey, and they get to witness a great miracle where Jesus feeds 5,000 by multiplying the 2 fish and the 5 loaves of bread. When you get down to Mark 6, verses 45 through 46, it's here where I believe we can see Jesus' compassion on his disciples as he recognizes their total exhaustion. It states, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. God will push us past our comfort levels, but he also knows that if we get too overworked, we will grow bitter towards our calling and lose the motivation to love the people we are called to serve. Just as Jesus sent the disciples away while he finished up the work, and just as Jesus made time to rest in the Father by himself after a long day of serving, we too must rest. So if you are beginning to despise your calling and you are not motivated to serve those God has called you to serve, this is probably a sign you need a season of rest in the Lord. Here's a related video called 3 Signs God Just Wants You to Focus on Him Right Now. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to show your support for me and this channel, one of the best ways you can do that is by tapping the subscribe button, and that'll also ensure that you don't miss any of the new videos I'm posting every single week. I really hope this video was helpful to you. Until next time, God bless.